The morning my half-brother walked into that boardroom, he was wearing a suit that cost more than my grandmother's first car. I know because she told me about that car once. A rusted-out 1987 Civic she drove from Sudbury to Toronto with everything she owned in 2 garbage bags on the back seat. She was 23. She built everything from nothing, and he walked in like he'd been there all along. I hadn't even known he existed until 6 weeks earlier. My name is Laurel. I'm 31 years old, and I worked as the operations director of a mid-sized logistics company in Hamilton, Ontario. A company my grandmother founded in 1991 with a second mortgage and a client list of 4. I'd been working there since I was 19, answering phones during summers, learning the routing software, sitting in on meetings my grandmother would wave me into with a flick of her wrist. "Pay attention," she'd say, not looking up from whatever spreadsheet she was reading. "This matters." She was the kind of woman who made everything feel like it mattered. Her name was Frances, not Grandma to the world. To the world she was Frances Kowalski, founder and majority shareholder of Kowalski Transport and Logistics, which by the time she passed had contracts with 3 provincial governments and a fleet of 47 vehicles operating out of Hamilton, London, and Thunder Bay. To me, she was Gran, just Gran. The woman who kept butterscotch candies in her blazer pocket and cried at figure skating and never once let me feel like I was anything other than exactly where I was supposed to be. My mother, her daughter, left when I was 7. Not dramatically. No fight, no goodbye scene at the door. She just started being somewhere else more than she was home. And then one day the somewhere else became permanent. My grandmother filed for legal guardianship 4 months later. A family court judge in Hamilton granted it without much fuss. I remember sitting in a hallway with a social worker who smelled like cherry lip balm while the adults talked. Someone brought me a juice box. Grape. I still can't drink grape juice. For the next 24 years, it was the 2 of us. Gran and me in that brick house on the mountain with the garden she swore she was going to redo every spring and never did. She drove me to school. She came to every track meet, even when her knees were bad. She co-signed my first apartment when I moved out at 24, and then called me 3 times a week to make sure I was eating properly. She taught me to read a balance sheet, taught me to negotiate, sat across from me at her kitchen table with a copy of every contract the company signed and walked me through what to look for. "Blood means nothing if there's no loyalty behind it," she said to me once. We were going over a vendor dispute, something boring about fuel surcharges, and it came out of nowhere. She didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. I was used to her saying things like that and letting them hang in the air. I understand now why she said it. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February. By April, the doctors were talking about palliative options. By June, she was mostly at home, and I was driving out to the mountain 3, sometimes 4 days a week, working remotely from her kitchen table while she rested in the next room. We had a routine. I'd make tea when I arrived. She'd come out around 10, sit with me for an hour. Some days she was sharp as ever. Other days she'd drift, get quiet, reach across, and pat my hand for no reason. She died on a Tuesday in late August. I was there. I held her hand. The house was very still afterward, the way houses get. The will was read 3 weeks later at her lawyer's office on King Street West. I drove downtown in the rain, parked in a lot that charged $18 for 2 hours, went upstairs to a waiting room with leather chairs, and a bowl of those wrapped mints that taste like toothpaste. I was the only one there. Gran's lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. O.C., who'd handled her affairs for 15 years, came out to greet me. He had an expression I couldn't read. "There's someone else joining us today," he said. I thought he meant an accountant, maybe someone from the company's board. He did not mean an accountant. The man who walked in 6 minutes later was tall, maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. He had the particular posture of someone who's used to entering rooms and being noticed. He introduced himself as Gavin. He said my grandmother's name like he'd practiced saying it. He sat down across from me at the table and smiled in a way that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Mr. O.C. read the will. Frances Kowalski left the majority of her estate, the company, the house on the mountain, her personal savings, which were considerable to me, to Laurel Ann Kowalski, her granddaughter and legal ward, raised in her care from age 7. Gavin received a specific bequest, a sum of $50,000, a framed photograph, and a letter sealed in an envelope that Mr. O.C. handed to him in silence. I didn't know what the letter said. I still don't. What I know is what happened in the 48 hours that followed. Gavin's lawyer called Mr. O.C.'s office. Then Gavin's lawyer called again. Then I received a formal notice that Gavin, apparently my mother's son from a relationship before me, which meant he was my half-brother, was contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. He was claiming my grandmother hadn't been of sound mind. He was claiming I had manipulated her. I sat in my car in the parking garage on King Street West and I read that notice twice. Then I called my own lawyer, a woman named Ms. Tran, who had handled my employment contract at the company and was the sharpest person I'd ever paid money to. She picked up on the second ring. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. What followed were 4 months that I would not wish on anyone. The legal process in Ontario for contesting a will is not fast, and it is not gentle, and it costs money in a way that makes you feel slightly sick every time you open your email. Gavin's legal team was well-resourced. His lawyer, a senior partner at a Bay Street firm, filed motion after motion, requesting access to Gran's medical records, requesting her communications with Mr. O.C., requesting my employment records at the company, apparently trying to establish that I had somehow engineered my own position there. I had to explain to strangers that I had started working at my grandmother's company as a teenager because she invited me to, that I had earned every promotion, that the operations director title came after 7 years of progressively senior roles, that I had a paper trail going back 12 years that documented my contribution to that company's growth, that during the period they were most focused on, the last year of Gran's life when she was ill, I had been doing 2 jobs, my actual job and quietly managing everything she could no longer manage herself, at her request, with no additional compensation, because she was my grandmother and I loved her. Ms. Tran was methodical. She gathered everything. Medical testimony from Gran's oncologist confirming she had been cognitively intact. Sharp, in fact clearer than many patients until quite close to the end. Testimony from Ms. O.C. about the circumstances under which the will had been drafted and updated, the most recent revision having been made 14 months before Gran's death, at a point when she had not yet received her diagnosis. Testimony from 2 members of the company's board who had worked alongside Gran for decades and had spoken with her regularly throughout her illness. And then there was the binder. Gran kept binders. This was a known fact to anyone who'd spent more than an afternoon in her orbit. Color-coded binders for company records, binders for financial planning, binders for recipes she was never going to make. Among her papers, sorted after her death as part of the estate administration, was a binder Mr. O.C. had been holding in trust. Inside, it was a handwritten document, not a legal document, not a formal letter, but something closer to a personal record. Gran's handwriting, unmistakable, the same slanted print she used to write grocery lists and birthday cards, dated 2 years before her death, pages of it. She had written about me, about my mother, about the choice she'd made to raise me, about the years she spent trying to locate my mother, who had moved to British Columbia and apparently started a new life that did not include either of us, about Gavin. She had known about him. She'd found out years earlier, through channels she didn't specify, and had tried once to make contact. He hadn't responded. She had written about that too, about deciding after careful thought that the people who showed up were the people who mattered, about believing that inheritance wasn't about blood. It was about presence, about work, about love that showed up even when it was inconvenient. Laurel has never needed to be asked, she wrote, in a passage Mr. O.C. read into the record during the hearing. She has been here. That is the whole of it. She has been here. The hearing was held at the Ontario Superior Court of Justice in Hamilton. I wore a dark blazer over a plain blouse. I'd had maybe 4 hours of sleep. I sat beside Miss Tran at the respondent's table and tried to look like a person who was not terrified. Gavin sat across the room. He was flanked by 2 lawyers and a paralegal who kept scrolling through a tablet. He didn't look at me. Not once for the first hour did he look at me. His legal team's case rested heavily on the argument that my grandmother's relationship with me had been so total, so consuming, that she had been unable to form independent judgment about her estate. They called it coercive control, and hearing it applied to me and to Gran made me feel something I don't entirely have a word for. Rage is too hot. Grief is too passive. It was somewhere in between. Miss Tran was calm throughout. She asked careful questions. She let the medical witnesses say what they had to say. She introduced the binder into evidence methodically, without drama, the way you'd present a set of quarterly reports. She let Gran's words do their own work. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke about the routing software Gran had first shown me when I was 22, how she'd sit beside me and correct my analysis without impatience. I talked about the Thursday morning calls we'd had for years, just the 2 of us, going over the week's operations. I talked about the last months driving out to the mountain, making tea, sitting at the kitchen table, I talked about the butterscotch candies. I don't know why I mentioned those. I just did. The presiding judge was a woman, the Honorable Justice Okonkwo, who had a reputation among Hamilton lawyers for being exceptionally precise and entirely without tolerance for procedural theatrics. She had read everything in advance. That was clear from the quality of her questions. At one point, she asked Gavin's lead counsel very quietly to explain the evidentiary basis for the allegation that I had influenced my grandmother's legal consultations, given that every interaction between my grandmother and Mr. Osi had occurred without my presence and had been documented accordingly. The counsel began to explain. Justice Okonkwo looked at him for a moment and then said, "I've read the file, Mr. Hartley. Answer the question." He didn't have a good answer. The decision came 22 days later, delivered in writing. I read it at my kitchen table in Hamilton with a cup of coffee that went cold. Justice Okonkwo found that there was no credible evidence of undue influence. She found that my grandmother had been of full testamentary capacity at the time the will was drafted and at subsequent review points. She found that the contest had been brought without a sufficient evidentiary foundation and, in her assessment, reflected a misunderstanding of how long-term caregiving relationships function within families. She awarded costs against Gavin's estate claim. She also noted, briefly and without elaboration, that the handwritten document in the binder represented, in her view, an unusually clear articulation of testamentary intent. She described my grandmother's prose as precise and persuasive. I think Gran would have liked that. I sat there for a while after reading it. The coffee was cold. Outside it was November and the leaves were gone, and the light was the flat gray particular to Hamilton in late autumn. I thought about Gran in that house on the mountain. In the garden, she never got around to fixing, telling me to pay attention because things matter. I thought about the binder. I thought about the fact that she had known, somehow, had anticipated, or maybe just prepared out of the same instinct for documentation that she applied to everything, and had left me what I needed. I called Miss Tran. She was measured and professional and said all the right things. After we hung up, I called the company's general manager, a steady man named Gordon, who'd been with Gran for 18 years, and told him the outcome. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "She always said you'd be fine." I thanked him and got off the phone before I started crying, which I did anyway, alone in the kitchen, which felt right. Gavin did not appeal. I don't know if that was a legal calculation or something else. I haven't heard from him since the decision. I don't know what Gran's letter said to him. I don't know what he thought he was walking into when he came to that will reading in September, or what he believed he was owed by a woman he had never once shown up for. I try not to spend too much time on it. What I spend time on instead is the company. I've been back full-time since January. We have a board meeting next month where I'll be presenting a 3-year growth strategy that Gran and I had started sketching out the summer before she got sick. We're looking at expanding the Thunder Bay operation. We're close to finalizing a federal contract that would have made her quietly enormously pleased. Gordon says she would have already had 3 color-coded binders prepared for the kickoff meeting. He's probably right. The house on the mountain sold in March. I kept the garden, which is a strange thing to say about a property I no longer own, but what I mean is I kept the image of it. The slightly overgrown hedge, the raised bed she meant to redo, the way the light hit the back fence in the morning. I kept the binder. I kept the butterscotch candies I found in the pocket of her last blazer when I was going through her things. I put them in a small dish on my kitchen windowsill, and I haven't touched them. I'm not sure I ever will. She was here. And that, in the end, is the whole of it.